I think actually 20 years later, if I'm not mistaken. In chapter 30, verses 25 through 43, he tries to cheat Jacob again, except this time, when Jacob begins to want to return back to his homeland, to return back to his family. It's been 20 years. It's time to go home. I need to begin building my own 401k with sheep and goats and not building Laban's 401k. I need to go build my own life. It's time for me to do my thing. Thanks, Laban. Thanks, Uncle. It's been real. But we need some distance. And Laban kind of reaches this agreement with Jacob. Here's your wage, figuring out the wages and the severance and all these types of things. Jacob comes up with this plan that let me get all the speckled and the black sheep. And there's this whole list. We're going to read it here in just a second. And Laban basically takes all the sheep that fit these characteristics, puts a distance between them so that theoretically there's absolutely no way that Jacob's getting out of this with anything. I mean, he sets the deck against him, literally. Let's read it. Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 43. Again, this is 20 years after dealing with one another. Verse 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so that I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I have worked for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." Then Laban said, "Name your wages and I will pay them." Don't go anywhere, Jacob. God is blessing me because you're here. Name your price. Verse 29, so Jacob said to him, "You know how I have served you and how your herds have fared with me, for you have had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me. And now when will I also do something for my own family?" Laban asked, "What should I give you?" And Jacob said, "You don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock. Let me go through all your sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted, every dark-colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats. Such will be my wages. In the future, when you come to check on my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are not black, they will be considered stolen." Jacob thinks he's about to make out pretty well with this. Until verse 34. "Good," said Laban, "let it be as you have said." That day Laban removed the streaked and the spotted male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one that had any white on it and every dark-colored one among the lambs, and he placed his sons in charge of them. He put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. Meanwhile, he was shepherding the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob then took branches of fresh poplar, almond, and plane wood and peeled the bark, exposing white strips on the branches. He set the peeled branches in the troughs in front of the sheep and the water channels where the sheep came to drink, and the sheep bred when they came to drink. The flocks bred in front of the branches and bore streaked, speckled, and spotted young. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face the streaked sheep and the completely dark sheep in Laban's flocks. And he set his own stock apart and didn't put them with Laban's sheep. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the troughs in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flocks, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich. He had many flocks, female and male slaves, and camels and donkeys. Jacob, being true to his name, turns the tables on his scheming uncle Laban. Laban tries to retain his services, then tricks him into working for him and thinking that he'll get nothing from me. It's the perfect setup. And very interestingly, Jacob resorts to what appears to be some type of magical incantation of peeling almond bark and putting it in front of the feeding troughs and thinking this is going to work. And it's amazing, despite all of that, God blesses Jacob. It's not commending Jacob for his actions in that. The point is that God is blessing Jacob despite all of this. Laban tries to cheat Jacob again, but Jacob gets the upper hand this time, and the Lord blesses him through this still. And then comes the last part. Chapter 31, verse 24. When it's time to go, and Jacob knows after all these experiences, he's not getting out of there without some type of fight. And when Laban practically has his back turned, Jacob gathers everything and takes off. Leaves him high and dry. Chapter 31. Now Jacob heard what Laban's sons were saying. Jacob has taken all that was our father's and has built this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob saw Laban's face, that his attitude toward him was not the same as before. The Lord said to him, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you." 20 years later, God is still making this promise to Jacob. The Lord sends Jacob back home just as he had promised. But when he takes off, Laban comes after him. Verse 22 of Genesis 31. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. So he took his relatives with him, pursued Jacob for 7 days, and overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. Is this another Esau moment? Feels like it. Jacob's having some deja vu of those troubled days of his youth when he thought his life was over. When he was running like a fugitive for fear of his life. And here he's doing the same thing, except not from his brother Esau, but from Laban, his uncle. His life is in jeopardy. Laban will strangle him if he catches him. He's fled with everything, grandchildren, sheep, wealth, material blessings, everything. Jacob took it all and has fled. And as Laban is pursuing Jacob and overtakes him, just when he's about to get him, the Lord intervenes this time again. Verse 24. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night. Watch yourself, God warned him. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. God has intervened yet again in the life of Jacob. Jacob probably met his match with Laban. But through God's grace, he prevailed. And now he's heading back home after 20 years. 20 years of these promises that God had given him. I'll bring you back to this land. And here it all begins. We're heading back. And he has all this wealth. He has all these children. God has been so kind and gracious and good to him in this time away. And he's going back to the land of his family. And he finally really does meet his match on the way. Genesis chapter 32. This is the last chapter of Jacob's life. Well, pretty much. Along the way, angels meet up with him. He names this place. Jacob begins to send messengers ahead of him to greet Esau. It becomes pretty apparent, almost up front, that Jacob's got to face the consequences of his past. If he's going to live well in this land, he's got to settle things with Esau. 20 years has probably been enough to take the edge off of it, but, he did cheat him out of everything he had. He's got to face these consequences. Irony hangs in the air. I love to encourage people sometimes as you're reading about, try to read it as if it's the first time you've ever read it. We get so familiar with these stories that I feel like we lose the edge of it sometimes. If this was the first time you were hearing this story, you'd be sitting on the edge of your seat. He's going back to Esau? Well, he has to. He had to get away from Laban. Is there anywhere this man can go and live? He begins to send messengers ahead of him to try to satisfy Esau. In verse 9 of chapter 32, he begins to pray. It's almost like he's sending up a Hail Mary here. Lord, my last effort, my last hope. Just help me out, please. Verse 9, then Jacob said, God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, go back to your land and to your family, and I will cause you to prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Indeed, I crossed over the Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two camps. Please rescue me from my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. Otherwise, he may come and attack me, the mothers and their children. You have said, I will cause you to prosper, and I will make your offspring like the sand of the sea, too numerous to be counted. It's interesting to me that God doesn't say anything to Jacob right here. Or at least Jacob doesn't give him time to. He immediately begins to send party after party to meet Esau. He abandons his approach in prayer and begins to try to appease Esau with all these goods. He sends one band of sheep and servants and all these things. And then he sends a second wave and then a third wave. And if you're wondering what his strategy was, he tells us in verse 20. You are also to say, look, your servant Jacob is right behind us, for he thought, I want to appease Esau with the gift that is going ahead of me. After that, I can face him, and perhaps he will forgive me. Jacob starts out praying. Seems like he quickly abandons that strategy. We can probably relate. I don't know if y'all like me, but I'm prone to want to move on if I don't get a quick answer from the Lord in prayer. There's wisdom in learning patience in praying. Jacob hadn't learned it yet. Moves on to this appeasement plan. Let me see if I can appease Esau enough that he doesn't kill me when he sees me. Then Jacob begins to be concerned about his kids and his wives, and he goes and he hides them, and then he's left all alone. Yet again, here we are at the end of Jacob's story, all alone, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing, because he's sent everything to try to appease Esau. He don't even have a rock to lay his head on this time. Jacob is left alone by himself with his thoughts. Look at verse 24 through the end of chapter 32. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. Jacob, he replied. Your name will no longer be Jacob, he said. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. Jacob then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, he said, yet my life has been spared. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. That is why still today the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle that is at the hip socket, because he struck Jacob's hip socket at the thigh muscle. The last time Jacob was alone with God, he dreamed about a heavenly ladder, but this time he finds himself in a wrestling match, though we don't initially know that it's God right off the bat. You have this ominous setting. Jacob's out in the middle of nowhere, all his thoughts to himself. He's alone in the middle of the night. He's hoping that his brother doesn't find him to kill him. Lying there with all the anxiety and worries weighing on his mind, in a moment's notice, a hand grabs a hold of him. Is it Esau? Is it Laban? Is it Isaac? And the list goes on. We quickly learn it's none of these guys. Only God has the power to touch a man's hip and render him totally incapacitated. Dislocates the hip with just a touch of his finger. God wrestles with him. He struggles with him. Jacob is living up to his name. He's trying to get ahead. He's trying to prevail over the other. He's been wrestling with men his entire life. He came out of the womb wrestling with Esau. He's wrestled with his uncle. He wrestled with his father. He's wrestled with probably countless others that we didn't read about. And here, on arguably the worst night of his life, when it seems that everything is evaporating right in front of him, all things are out of his control, his life is over yet again. And he's trying to prevail over this stranger that has showed up in the middle of the night, wrestling with him, tossing him to the ground. He's worn out. He's tired. But in the midst of all this wrestling, the Lord changes Jacob, transforms him. A new identity emerges from this wrestling match. And it really has two steps. The first is that Jacob has to confess who he is. What is your name? The mysterious wrestler asked Jacob. Tell me your name, young man. Cheater. Schemer. Always trying to best the other. My name is Jacob. Jacob has to come to terms with who he is, as he has all these fears of Esau and Laban. Everything is caught up with him. He can't deny it any longer. This is who I am. I'm a cheat, Lord. And then the Lord says, your name will no longer be Jacob. You've been a cheat your whole life, but you won't from this point forward. You've been a scam artist from day one, but no longer, Jacob. You won't go by that name anymore, not after tonight. Jacob, I've been wrestling with you for 20 years and you didn't even know it. And it's all coming to a head on this night when you ain't got nowhere else to turn, brother. You can't go face Esau. You can't face Laban. You've abandoned your wife and kids, and you're lying out here in the wilderness scared for your life. You have nowhere to turn. So tell me your name one more time. Jacob. You'll never be called that again. From this point forward, you are Israel. You are Israel because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. The Lord prompts him to confess himself, and then he changes him. A new identity emerges from this. And Jacob comes walking back across the river after the day has broken, limping. And I think he learned something. Walking with a limp ain't so bad if God's grace will carry you. Walking with a limp ain't so bad if God's grace will carry you through life. Every time he felt that pain, he remembered this night when he wrestled with God. Let me tell you something. When I about broke that fourth toe of my right foot back in the summer, I didn't walk around like this any longer. I had my eyes glued to the ground looking for every rock and stone and pebble that was anywhere nearby. The pain taught me something. It reminded me. Every time I flinch my toe, I remember now. Make sure you watch where you're walking. Every time Jacob took a step for the rest of his life, he thought about the grace of God that had changed him. Every time he struggled to get up in the morning, every time it was stiff, every time it hurt, he thought about the grace of God that had been upon him for the last 20 years, that had changed his life. Every time he got tired chasing those grandkids around, and he had to take a seat because he hurt, he remembered, I'm no longer who I used to be because of this experience that I had with God. My life has been changed. Walking with a limp ain't so bad if God's grace carries you through life. You know, as I read that and I see the life of Jacob, if we had countless amount of hours, there's so many other things I'd want to say. But something impresses itself upon me, specifically because at the beginning you have that dream that has a clear reference to Jesus. Jesus claims it for himself in John 1:51. But as you read this wrestling match where God strikes Jacob to carry forward his purposes, God would one day strike his chosen one again. Except this time it would do far more than dislocate a hip. It would kill him. Jesus went up on the cross and bore the wrath of God, the punishment for our sin, the curse for our brokenness. Jesus bore it all in totality so that we might have a new identity with God, so that we might have a new name, so that we would be changed by the grace of God. Jesus is Jacob's ladder and apparently his hip as well in this story. God would one day do again what he had did in the life of Jacob, to carry forward his purposes, to bless his people, and to create a new people by his grace. Many wrestlings, many struggles, but God will ultimately prevail. Let me pray for you. Father, as we come to a close this evening and just survey the vastness of this character, Jacob, Lord, no doubt we see our own selves as parts of his story. But I pray also, Lord, that we would see you in this story. That we would see how all these stories point to you and what has been accomplished in you. That you wrestled on our behalf, that we might have a new name. That you went up on the cross, that God's blessings would be communicated to all the families of the earth. Lord, I pray we'd also would learn that even as we walk through trials, even as we walk through struggles, Lord, your grace doesn't abandon us. It changes us, molds us, shapes us, transforms us. So, Lord, help us to learn from these stories of how Jacob wrestled with you and you changed his life, of how you also wrestle with us in your grace, Lord, and change us from one degree of glory into the next. Lord, help us to learn from these stories that we would rejoice more and more in you and learn that we truly can trust you and take you at your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Have a great week. See you on Sunday morning.